Tomorrow night is a big night. I don't want to get cocky. Every time I've ever done that before about anything politically related, it's ended up disastrous to me. It's probably God teaching me something. But tomorrow night is VP debate night. Walz versus Vance. And looking at it on paper, any sports fans will know how far that gets you, but looking at it on paper, I like our chances. JD Vance has historically done very well in things like this, speaks very well. Tim Walz is some kind of cocaine-addled nightmare out of Minnesota with these weird hand gestures. And so I can't imagine he's doing well. According to CNN, he's fighting nerves, but I don't know. Dustin Grage knows him a lot better than I do. Joining me now, columnist at Town Hall, Dustin Grage. Okay, Dustin, they're saying Tim Walz is nervous. Now, this is the thing. People get elevated to these positions, and most people in the country don't know Tim Walz the way someone like you would know Tim Walz. Dustin, is he a good debater?
Well, I think he's a good communicator, which is, has its strengths, but it has its limits. In particular, when you get to an actual debate, though, he struggles quite a bit. Interpersonally, he's a pretty good communicator. Even public speaking, he's a pretty good communicator. When it comes to these debates, and he actually has someone pushing back on him with his policies and whatnot that have ultimately been pretty much failures all across the board. I mean, anything from education, where we've seen Minnesota consistently in the top 5 and outcomes, is now below the national average for elementary age kids. Contrast that to like a state like Florida, where they were right in the middle of the pack. Now they're number 1 post-COVID. And just all the way down the line, these policies have just failed dramatically. And that's going to come out here, I think, in the debate. He has a really tough time defending his own record. Tim Walz also had one of the biggest lies of the year in the last gubernatorial race, where he argued that well over half of the students had I think it was something around 80%, I'd have to double check the number, have missed less than 10 days of in-class learning, which of course was an abject lie. There's just nothing to defend on that. Matt Walsh did a great piece on it as well, too. But he gets caught up in these lies, and that's why we have this kind of saying called Tim Walz lies. He has a tough time remembering all of them over the years, especially when you go back to his beginning of his career when he represented a conservative district. He was an A-rated NRA member. A lot of people forget about this type of stuff, but he has to go back and remember all of these positions he's held over the years. And then over time, they have dramatically changed. And when you go back to actually, I think what JD Vance and his team should be looking at isn't the last debates with Dr. Scott Jensen, his last opponent, but the Jeff Johnson debates in his 2018 run, where Jeff actually has a very similar debate style as JD Vance, where he's a little bit more even keel with his personality, but he battles with the facts, and he just sets up Walz for these abject failures and how he has to respond to them. Jeff did a great job, example, cornering him on single-payer healthcare, where even in Minnesota, not a very popular thing. He ended up having to run away from this, but in the debate, he actually set up Walz to agree that he's actually for single-payer healthcare. And that election was very close. I want to say it was only about 5 points in the state of Minnesota, where we struggle so much with our statewide campaigns. He would struggle with something like that if he got cornered on the national stage. So that's why he's very worried about this. A guy like JD Vance, where it's not so much ping pow, personality, but it's really just coming back to the facts and cornering the guy on his record. It's a abject strength for JD Vance in this case. And it's a major weakness for Tim Walz. And kind of as Tim Walz has said in the past, he likes to brag about how none of his students ended up going to Yale. Well, he's about to struggle quite a bit here with a lawyer in JD Vance who graduated from Yale.
All right, Dustin, I have to ask, actually, we'll probably circle back to this debate in a moment, but Minnesota is such a wild state to so many people from the outside looking in. I'm not talking about the incredible fishing and lakes up there, which I've had so much fun in Minnesota. Politically, I mean, it's always been treated in my entire political life as some kind of purple state that might be an option. I've never seen even the slightest bit of red come out of there. But what is it, Dustin? Is it just standard America where you have the Minneapolis, St. Paul, which are essentially the Soviet Union, and then a bunch of rural people who are forced to live under their rule? Is that what? Is it that simple, or is it more complicated than that?
It is actually pretty much that simple. We just have this large populace where we struggle with these statewide elections, but regionally, Minnesota's only had trifecta, three-way control 2 times in the last century. Two of the times in the past, I think, 12 years is how often it's happened. One of them happened to happen under Walz, and even in this trifecta, Democrats only have a 1-seat majority in our state Senate. It's a very, very slim margin. And it wasn't until this last session where they actually started losing on some of these bills, because then their constituents in these tight Senate and House seats, where we have a chance to actually take back both chambers this cycle, even though we only have one Senate race up this cycle, there ended up having to be a special for a congressional race coming up here. So there's actually a lot of spending still here in Minnesota. They're trying to defend these seats after going through what has absolutely been the most far leftist agenda in state history, probably the nation, over these last 2.5 years. What we've seen from Walz's administration, they're having a really tough time defending these records between trying to push for a sanctuary state, going through, and they had a $20 billion surplus, largest state surplus in state history. I don't think we've had anything over $8 billion in state history. They burned through all of that and found a way to raise an additional $9 billion. That's a 40% increase in state government year to year, and they have no way to fund it going forward unless they keep taxing and spending.
Jeez. Okay, Dustin, let's circle back to Walz and the military stuff. This got super, super hot for 5 minutes after Walz was announced as the VP thing. It's a major, major deal to me. Honestly, not even the command sergeant major stuff as much as bailing on his troops right before deployment. That's just so despicable. But these things, have they trailed Walz? Do you hear it in your Minnesota circles or political circles? It kind of seems like that stuff has died, but veteran friends who are non-political of mine still bring it up. It really bothers them.
Yeah, and quite frankly, this is still an important issue. And I don't think it's like this mass issue that's going to, take, 25, 30% of the electorate plus. It's a smaller portion, but it's a very important issue that's important to independents in particular. And when you look at this state of Minnesota, there's more Democrats, like just straight up, there's probably 10% more Democrats than there are Republicans. That's why we struggle a little bit here. But we have a significant independent population here voting based in Minnesota. And that's how you get guys like Jesse Ventura elected. We're one of the few states that's ever elected a statewide independent. And there's a reason for that here in this state. And why do we see Kamala Harris with a 10% lead right out of the gate when Biden drops out? But now, since Tim Walz has entered the race and all this stuff that was never covered in the Minnesota media, never announced if it was covered. We've known about it for years. We brought it up on campaigns between his first congressional race all the way to the gubernatorial races. But quite frankly, just Minnesota media, they're owned by the liberal establishment here. They have to rely on larger infrastructure such as the DFL here. They have a very great election system. They have a monopoly in many cases. So they kind of lean on them. They're like, well, they're the guys in charge, so we're going to be friendly with the Democrats. And that's how they kind of created this monopoly a little bit here. But now that's on a national scale. It's actually being covered. And people here are noticing it now, finally. And since Tim Walz has entered the race, the latest Rasmussen poll actually showed Walz has dropped Kamala at 7 points since then. It's a 3-point race to Rasmussen. And even if you go to more of the kind of lefty pollsters in the state, I've seen as good as 5% down since then. So pretty dramatically, it's showing that. And even some of the congressional races here, they run their own internal polling. Every single poll has showed that with Walz on the ticket, they're actually less likely to support Kamala. So it's actually been really dramatic that way. He's such a polarizing figure between the lockdowns and now stuff. Not huge issues. They're not going to be backbreaking, but they really cut at the margins with the stolen valor stuff. And, of course, as you mentioned, dodging deployments. And, he's got a little bit of history with that as well. Even when in office, he likes to skip out on award ceremonies for current National Guard members when they get the highest honor possible through the president and Biden. We had an Afghanistan deployment here known as the Bastards. That's their name. They're a artillery I believe, deployment. No, tank division. They helped out in Afghanistan. They received the highest possible unit award, the presidential citation. Walz actually skipped that award ceremony despite being invited. And on top of that, he wasn't even capable of deploying his own National Guard here in Minnesota when Minneapolis was burning. So how can we even expect him to send resources over to North Carolina and Tennessee right now? I mean, he couldn't even do it in his home state. And this guy's just been an abject failure when it comes to a crisis actually dropping in front of his lap, whether it's deploying himself over to Iraq, whether it's deploying his own units over to Minneapolis, showing up to their award ceremony. I mean, how is this guy going to help on the national scale when he's not able to do that locally even?
I would thank you for coming to my YouTube channel, but I know how brilliant it is, and I know you love it here. So subscribe and watch. We're going to start really ramping things up and putting some funny stuff, some interesting stuff out there, some collaborations. Either way, my YouTube channel is officially the place to be. So stick around.